I know people who are really good coaches. They've been through like Landmark or Avatar. There's these programs, and they work a lot with shadow. And then I've worked with them, and they come to the point where they're very sophisticated, right? This very high level, where they realize, I help them realize that the shadow is just a structure you make up. So we make up a structure, the concept of shadow, and then we spend our whole lives trying to get rid of it. And I say, why make it up in the first place? Why take, me, I'm all about release complexity. Why take that first step? And that's where I think the leverage is. So you have all these people going around in these groups talking about shadow. It's the actual step that is in the way. Yeah. I don't want to take that step.
Yeah, it's interesting how much pain is built up around the structure of having a past trauma to work through, whereas just looking at it without judgment often can just be enough. It is interesting how much people build up these structures in their mind before they're able to actually tackle them, or whatever you want to call it, deconstruct them.
Exactly. So if that comes up in space, I'll say, if I'm being really playful, I'll say, shadow, where is it? Is it where is it? Or I'll say, if you didn't have the concept of shadow, what would you be experiencing now?
Good question.
Well, and then I'll say, because that's what you're actually experiencing. Everything else is a thought. And is it helpful or is it not helpful? Mm-hmm. To me, that's all the work is. Literally, it's not easy, but that's all it is. Everything else is a hyper-complexification of professional skills that sells the price of the ticket.
Yeah.
So there. That's what I really think.
You need a mic drop.
As a community, we have to, because, and this is my answer to why we're so hyped up on this, is because it also has proliferated in an economic system where complexity and hypercomplexity and the illusion of the priestly professional class to do some direct work on yourself is part of what creates the demand and the interest. And so I'm not saying people do this consciously, but this is part of it. But we need people that can release the complexity and do this level of facilitation. It doesn't mean, people go, aha, yeah, of course. It's still hard, but you want to be it's like you want to be a surgeon with a laser. You don't want to be a surgeon in the Confederate Army where they would take a saw and cut off your leg. We want this technology to be like laser surgery, and we need people to really understand what works in these spaces and what just increases the complexity, infinite complexity of the human condition.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, because this idea that you can get rid of the ego or should get rid of the ego or the shadow is so preposterous to me, because they are structures, you could say evolutionary structures, that have a function and they do something. And by trying to remove them is exactly like trying to sever your limb. It's just, even if it is possible, it's not useful or healthy. So it seems to me that just allowing it and observing it and accepting it is a much healthier route. And, if you have an infection in the hand, you just look at it and you deal with the infection rather than chopping up the whole hand.
Exactly.
that does bring up something that I'm just noticing now about maybe incoherence in definitions that we're using. Like when I hear you talk about what I would term as ego deconstruction, it aligns with my idea about it. But I think I'm using a term that is not clicking with you. Like it's something about the ego deconstruction thing. And I think UV as well, it's not really working for you. So what would you call it? Like this deconstruction of frameworks that make up your identity that aren't necessarily true, just like we would say that's the shadow. what's the term if we're not going to use ego deconstruction?
Maybe I can answer it. In my case, it's just observing that something is a structure, because that, in a way, kind of makes it less sticky. When you can quiet the mind enough and just observe that it's doing something, like, it's engaging in this process, or it's like I have this feeling and then it triggers this thought. Oh, interesting. Just observing that kind of makes it less, I don't know, makes it less have, how would I describe it? Have less of a looping function.
Yeah, so I think that was a good reframe, because we can go off in all directions. So I will, so what I guess I'm pushing back against is problematizing the ego. And I think that's a little bit of what UV is saying. But I would say that it's important to understand, what do we mean by ego? What is, like, what's under the hood? And, there's egoism and ego. And so for example, I can talk about primary affect. So primary affect in my body is what, if my heart rate goes up or goes down, what neurochemical soup I'm in, what my hormones are doing, what my blood pressure is doing, my proprioception, am I dizzy? Some of my muscles are contracted, some are expanded. So there's something my body's doing, and this is not ego. It's pre-egoic potentials of basically of your mammalian self. Okay, so I can put that aside. That's not what I mean by ego. And then, so we call those affects. And then there's the perceptual system, which is just what you see, hear, taste, smell, your body sensations, your proprioception. This, again, is part of your mammalian human animal nature. That's not ego. So then what is ego, right? What then, if those are pre-egoic, then what is ego? And so,
to me, it's always seemed like the storyteller that builds an identity and attempts to explain those things.
It's the story.
Yeah.
Ego is story. Yeah. This is why Suzanne Cook-Greuter's work, everybody that is researching ego development, they ask questions. They're sentence completion tests, because it's this kind of story you will tell. So what I teach is to notice how and when the story, that mind serves up a story. Something's, your baby is crying, we get a little irritated, and the mind serves up a story. I remember once being on a plane, and this baby in front of me was literally way off the charts. Like, some people are blessed with very difficult children. And I could tell the parents, she must have been about 2 years old, and I could tell the parents had figured out their program for when she was having tantrums. And I'm talking about livid screaming, like for 20, 30 minutes. And I watched myself go from, like, those freaking parents, they're bad parents, why don't they do something about it, to, like, oh my God, this child is in so much pain, to, like, that stupid child, I would muzzle it or something. And I could see these stories just come up one after another, kind of, trying to give me some explanation or trying to suggest something I could do. And then once I realized that, I was just watching them come up. And then slowly my body wasn't irritated. It was just noise. Like, I was kind of like, oh, listen to the frequencies or something. And then, the child calmed down, and I have a feeling that, like, energetically, there's something that, like, I was, like, probably got caught into, like, energizing that energy or something, And so literally the body just serves up all these, even when we're happy, the body serves up this story, like, oh, maybe you should spend more time with him. there's a story, right? You have fun. Oh, maybe you should spend some more time with him. And then you get in that story. And of course, you know where that story goes. The first little thought starts to build this whole story about your happily ever life, you know? And then you go to your friends and then you build more of that story. So then the question becomes like, once you start working with the stories, a couple of interesting things happens, and you realize that you're tortured by the story, but there's a big part of you that doesn't want to live without one. You feel the mind will not be satisfied with like if I say to someone, like I said before, like if you didn't have the concept of shadow, what would your experience be? And you realize like, well, I actually would be disappointed because there's not enough drama. And now you start to realize, oh, well, that's the function the story has in your life. It's kind of a drama. Cool. If you want to live like that, it's maybe you need to watch more TV or something. But I don't problematize it. We want to understand, first of all, why the mind serves up stories. Are they profitable? Are they beneficial? And then if you notice that, yeah, actually, I like them, then you understand you're complicit with, that's why you keep generating them, because you're actually, something is satisfied by having the stories. And so a lot of people are in drama. I mean, kids do that. When you're irritated with your sister when you're a kid, you kind of like poke to make a fight, and then it becomes a fight. And when you look back on it, or at the time, you realize, you talk about it as if you didn't want to fight, but energetically you wanted to get in a fight. And that's why you kind of provoked it, And so you start to see the sum total of human condition is really fascinating, and for us to understand it is more important than for us to fight with some of it. It's here the way it is.
That's a great distinction between deconstruction and just becoming aware. I'm glad you made that distinction, because I keep using the term ego deconstruction when it actually should be differentiated between those two.
Mm-hmm.
That's helpful.
It's more like ego, understanding what is the ego and how you can literally learn how to see how, oh, there it is, composing itself. Oh, there it is, composing itself. Oh, there's a story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It seems the awareness part of it seems to relate to where the ego is actually necessary. Like, you don't want to deconstruct everything. You want to know where some elements are necessary. Like, I want my child to behave well in public and not disturb other people and that kind of thing. So there's this kind of egoic element to that of like, don't embarrass me, kid, which is actually kind of useful to help the kid behave properly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Or sometimes I'll see it. I'll see the story and I'll look at it and I'll say, even in group space, and I'm like, I'm just going with it. I just feel tugged. And sometimes that gives a lot of pushback, but then it turns out sometimes that pushback has been helpful to move things forward, But if you can slow what is happening automatically down so you can see how it works, you have more choice. And then you do that for 5 or 6 years, and eventually what shows up is more helpful than not. Somehow you've shaped the way it works, so you don't have to be so vigilant. The whole point is not to be like incredibly vigilant your whole life.
Mm-hmm. There's something here that I've been trying to pinpoint, and it's coming from experience. So haven't figured out how to put words to it yet. But there's this thing of, actually, it relates to what you said. When people enter into a group practice and they want to appear smart, they want to figure out where they rank against everyone else in the group. So they want to project some ideal version of themselves. And there's something of that related to a desire to have an outcome be a certain way. I want to be perceived a certain way. I want this call to work out a certain way. A lot of it's to do with ranking, but there's also just an attachment to results out there in the world, which to me seems to be a basis for the ego storyteller thing. And I haven't found much of a basis outside of that. It's like, That seems to be a center point that I'm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on
that? So the ranking is the structure that your stories take, right? So we said the ego has to do with a story, but then you can notice that the stories that there are some basic structures. Gurdjieff said that there's one mother structure beneath all the other structures. So you start to see that your stories are helpful, even the helpful ones, whether they're helpful or not, they repeat a structure. So ranking is one of the structures. Was a big one, this one really big. And one of the key signs, so there's basically 6 different structures. Ranking is one. The 2 biggest ones are ranking and belonging. Belonging, people with high belonging needs get very nervous when people rank because it seems like other people being excluded. They don't want to exclude. And rankers, it's an instinct. You walk into a room, maybe it's just a big conference and you're at dinner, you just look around and you sit with someone, and maybe it's not someone who presented, but it turned out to be the big kahuna. Like you just have an instinct for the alpha or something, and that's not a problem. I think these are typologies. They actually curiously map onto the 6 Buddha bodies. So that's kind of interesting. When you take on in Dzogchen, you take on one of those deities at the end of, you find like what your kind of archetypal pattern is. But the key is when you're driven by a subtle sense of it's never enough. It's never enough. So people who are rankers, even though they achieve all kinds of things, they don't think they've achieved anything. And it's never enough. And so you become first of all, neurotic, but, you become aggressive and non-ethical almost in your pursuit of something that's not satiable. Belongers are the same way. They have so many friends and it's never enough. It's never enough. They feel like they're worthless and nobody likes them. And from the outside, you're like, what? So it's not that the typology is bad. It's when it's driving you with the subtle sense that it's never enough. You never let yourself say, wow, I have a lot of friends and they stick by me. Or, wow, I've done a lot with my life. And, I don't really like being on the circuit, but I'm chasing this invitation and that invitation and this. Why? Really? What's the real reason why? Because I don't think I've done enough. It's never enough. So the typology is not a problem, but and then when you get rid of what's driving that it's not enough, then usually your life spreads out in a different way, and you make much more of a garden variety of choices rather than the same choice. So the way that works is the ego has stories. The stories, if you look at them, you'll see they're structured. There's a predominant structure that's unconsciously driving you to this sense of there's never enough. So it's a kind of neuroses.
The brand new Future Thinkers members portal is now live. Develop your sovereignty and self-knowledge with our in-depth courses, get access to our weekly sense-making calls, join the Q&As with past podcast guests, and much more. Become a Future Thinkers member today at futurethinkers.org/members. Enter the Future Thinkers giveaway and win our brand new community membership, including in-depth courses, private calls, and more, as well as a supply of Qualia, a complete cognitive upgrade for your brain. To enter the contest, simply go to futurethinkers.org/giveaway and sign up for our mailing list to instantly get our 50-page guide on how to adapt to the future. There are many ways to increase your chances of winning. Enter the competition today.